The recently released annual report on United States policy towards South Sudan addresses concerns over poor governance, extension of the arms embargo, among other issues. Part of the report states, 10 years after independence, South Sudan remains a deeply fragile nation beset by weak governance, pervasive insecurity, fiscal mismanagement, and widespread corruption. In South Sudan, the US government, USG, has three main priorities: support the emergence of core institutions of democratic governance to counter violent competition for political power, reduce the need for humanitarian assistance, and lay the groundwork for a self-reliant South Sudan that can enable long-term recovery and economic growth. Join us as we discuss this and more only on Beyond the Headlines. Our guest on the program is Mr. Edmund Yakani, the Executive Director of Community Empowerment for Progress Organization, abbreviated as CEPO. Welcome to Beyond the Headlines.
Thank you very much, and thanks always to be with you in this particular platform to share information with the public and your listeners.
The US Congress, which is comprised of the House of Representatives and the Senate, recently released its annual policy report on South Sudan. The US Congress stated in the report, 1, the signatories to the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, signed on September 12, 2018, have delayed implementation, leading to continued conflict and instability in South Sudan. 2, despite years of fighting, 2 peace agreements, punitive actions by the international community, and widespread suffering among civilian populations, the leaders of South Sudan have failed to build sustainable peace. What is alarming to you or also to the citizens that should be of concern to them in regards to the statement that has been made by the US Congress?
I think what's alarming is that US being part of TRACA group as sort of like friends of South Sudan for the implementation of peace agreement are now officially expressing frustration so much. And I think this particular policy statement of US, it is a wake-up call for our leaders, because what is alarming is that now they're coming boldly, and if you see in this statement, it's clear that they're using practical examples where our leaders have not shown any political will and commitment to deliver expectation that is expected from them. One of them is a revitalized peace agreement. Another one is a question of individual and community safety and security among various communities of South Sudan. So if you see those messages, it's clearly that US is coming forward. Of course, as you said, it's a policy statement. And of course, you know, the way how US system operate, this lay down a foundation for maybe more tough action that may come from US. Either we should expect, if this frustration continue, they may come out with either an act on South Sudan. As you know, the way how US operates, that normally they have to enact a legislation that deal with a particular situation, particular country. But I think this is an alarm. This is a wake-up call for our leaders to take it up. But also the use of the language. The language is more straightforward language and quoting examples that the leaders have committed themselves to assure the world or to assure the global community that under their leadership, they will ensure they will deliver the revitalized agreement, and they'll ensure that safety of individuals and cities in the country is a top priority. But on the reality or on the ground, the proof is showing that they're not delivering that. And I think this is really a challenging to the current leadership. As I said, it's a wake-up call that they have to take it serious and hope that they really listen to this policy, and they have still an opportunity at hand if they can utilize the call made in this policy and translate them into a real action on the ground.
Furthermore, the unclassified report from the US Congress also addressed the issue of arms embargo. It stated in the report that the United Nations arms embargo on South Sudan, most recently extended by 1 year on May 31st, 2022, through United Nations Security Council Resolution 2577, 2021 is necessary to stem the illicit transfer and destabilizing accumulation and misuse of small arms and light weapons in perpetuation of the conflict in South Sudan. The United States should call on other member states of the United Nations to redouble efforts to enforce the United Nations arms embargo on South Sudan. The United States, through the United States mission to the United Nations, should use its voice and vote in the United Nations Security Council in favor of maintaining the United Nations arms embargo on South Sudan until A, the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan is fully implemented, or B, credible, fair, and transparent democratic elections are held in South Sudan. Based on the report that I just read about the arms embargo that came from the US government, do you think that the arms embargo needs to be extended against South Sudan?
I think, of course, the principle of the arms embargo is not like a kind of a culture of hatred against the government of South Sudan, but the arms embargo is being used as a pressure point to push our leaders to a corner that they can show political will and commitment to deliver what they have mentioned as a preconditions for lifting the arms embargo in terms of ensuring the revitalized peace agreement is implemented by spirit and letter, and ensuring that there's a fair and credible elections where there's no culture of rigging or any malpractices. You have to say it's transparent and credible. So I think the arms embargo, in the sense of the continuous violence among the communities where these arms are not manufactured in South Sudan, these arms are flown from outside. And as we said, the formal military confrontation, or what do you call the conventional fights among the armed groups or political in South Sudan have stopped. At least the ceasefire is holding. But if you see at the period where the ceasefire is holding, we have a deadly armed, political motivated communal violence that is claiming huge life of innocent civilians and is really destroying communities. As we speak with you now, weekly, at least we lost between 10 to 17 lives of innocent civilians that are happening across the country due to a deadly armed violence among the communities. And of course, this armed struggle among the communities is aided by the political elites, that some of them are sitting in a very influential state institutions. Some of them are politically, some of them are in the uniform institutions, and they use those arms to arm their communities or support their communities to fight against each other. I think based on these facts, that we're losing lives of innocent civilians, and even humanitarian workers have been attacked, and access to humanitarian work is being hindered by ongoing armed communal violence. Based on these facts, I think arms embargo act as a process that helps the international community to hold our government accountable in terms of providing a conducive environment for safety and security of individuals and communities, but also winning political will to have a political attitude change that meets the best interest of the citizens, which is peace and stability. So I think the arms embargo, it is not a name and shame game, but it is a pressure point that our leaders need to commit themselves, as the preconditions were given. If they're able to implement the revitalized peace agreement, if they're able to conduct credible and fair elections, then this arms embargo become null and void. It's of no any more importance, because the question of successful political transformation is achieved through elections. The question of safety and security of individuals and citizens is secured by having a respect to human rights, by ensuring there's a rule of law, ensuring that humanitarian workers can move across the country without facing any hindrance, or even they're not targeted. Like what I've seen recently in Lair, where it is a communal, the term is a communal violence, but you can see it's a more of a confrontation between the forces of the SPLA-IO as an opposition and the South Sudan People Defense Force. Humanitarian workers were killed. There's a report of gang rape. So all those incidents is challenging humanity. So under the global principle to protect, I think the international community under the umbrella of UN take legitimacy to impose a strategy like arms embargo to ensure that lives of innocent citizens and their properties is protected by their own government, like the government of South Sudan. So I think the arms embargo, it is a legitimate process that international community is using it as a pressure point on the leaders in South Sudan to deliver peace and stability for the best interests of the citizens of South Sudan.
The United States Department of State, in consultation with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and other relevant federal agencies and departments, also submitted this report to the United States policy on South Sudan. The report stated, with less than a year remaining in the transition period established by the RRCS, the tribunal only delivered some of the legislation required to initiate drafting of the permanent constitution and establish the framework for elections to the Transitional National Legislative Assembly, TNLA, on February 14, 2022. None of this legislation is available for public review. The Justice Ministry maintains key election amendments have not yet been drafted, and other ministers claim legislation governing political party formation must also still be drafted. Similarly, laws to regulate the various security services, including the necessary unified forces, only reached the TNLA on February 14, 2022. The TNLA, formed on August 30th, 2021, took over 5 months to organize its internal structure and commence legislative business, including budget legislation that has taken precedence over electoral legislation. What is your take on the issue related to legislation raised in the report?
It is really a genuine concern that was raised because it's a concern of everybody, even here in South Sudan, as the lifespan of the revitalized peace agreement is ending in 22 February 2023, which we're left with less than 6 to 7 months from now for the end of the lifespan of the agreement. The question of the exit strategy become a big concern for everybody. And one of the best strategy that you can use for exit, it is conducting a free and fair elections. But you can't have a free and fair elections if you don't have a conducive environment for conducting free and fair elections. The conducive environment is described by having reforms, and these reforms are really in two directions. One direction of these reforms is institutional reforms. And by institutional reforms, we think about the reconstitution of the National Electoral Commission, the reconstitution of the National Political Party Council. These are two very important institutions with regard to conduct of a free and fair elections. But also you need to see that the institution of the security sector, what is termed as a unified command structure, have to be functional, and it have to deliver all the required tasks for security arrangement that will create a conducive environment where you have a forces that is described as forces of the government for security and defense that pay allegiance to the constitution. And this automatically link you with the constitution making process. It's very important. Specifically, the bill for defining the constitution making process is very important before we could rush for elections. If we don't have a constitution, but at least we should have a law that define how constitution making process is going to happen. So that is side of reforms of institutional. If you come to policies, it is necessary really to look into the National Electoral Act in terms of its reform and amendment. The same thing to the National Political Party Council Act also need to be properly reviewed, because these are legislations that will define for you processes that can describe free and fair elections. Then this is accomplished with other institutions legislation that may affect freedoms that are associated with electoral process. For example, freedom of association, assembly, freedom of free media. All these require certain institutions to commit themselves to this value as enshrined in South Sudan Constitution Bill of Rights. So this means the laws that are associated with security institution, being the National Defense Force is very important. The National Police Service is very important. The National Security Act is very important to be reviewed, to be in line with the principle of creating a conducive environment for free and fair elections. So these reforms, being it institutional or being legislative or policy, is very important to describe what is called as well preparation for conduct of democratic elections. And I think this is what has been raised. But also, I think one thing that I'd like to bring with this particular point is the timing of this particular policy statement, which I like to make it here very clear. If you see this timing is heading towards the July we have key events happening. And in those events, some political decision is required. So I think the timing is strategic to really put enough time for our leaders to look into this policy and to respond. When will our leaders respond? They should be responding during the visit of the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury to South Sudan, as we're all aware that in July, they're visiting us in early July, 5th to the 7th. And that is immediately followed by our independence on the 9th July. So where our leaders are going to address the nation about their political commitment and their political will to deliver this country from the current situation we're in to peace and stability. But at the same time, July also is a month for AU summit prior the next January AU summit for the end of the lifespan of the agreement. So July AU summit is also a very important summit that AU have to make decisions on the phase of exit strategy for South Sudan. So if you see the timing of this report, it's very strategic, but also if you see the approach taken in this particular policy statement, it's really heading towards making a very important legislative and political decision of US government that may lead, as you said, USAID, some institutions have already submitted this report. This may lead for a government decision on how to deal with South Sudan. And of course, this is following several calls that have been met in US. So I think for me, for the government of South Sudan, they take this particular report serious.
The US government and its non-governmental agencies doubt elections will take place in South Sudan next year, 2023. Based on the report, they stated that South Sudan has not established the necessary preconditions for free and fair elections, evidenced by continued delays in establishing the legal frameworks, independent electoral institutions, and civic spaces to enable genuine political competition and democratic elections. This includes failure to date to enact and amend key legislations, inclusive electoral processes, including voter registration, voter education, and polling day procedures for IDPs and refugees, boundaries for electoral constituencies, and provisions for an electoral that is 65% illiterate must be addressed. Without significant external support and oversight, South Sudan's transitional government is unlikely to carry out the tasks necessary to prepare for and hold elections consistent with the RRCA's and South Sudan's transitional constitution. There appears to be two distinctively different forms of communication when it comes to the elections being held next year in 2023. Here, the US government is doubting that the elections will be held come next year, while the South Sudan government has consistently communicated to the public that they should not only prepare themselves for elections, but they should also go ahead and make sure that they cast their vote. Have you noted the two distinctively different forms of communication, and what should citizens think about it?
To be honest with you, for us to have credible, free and fair, non-violent elections, there are very essential preconditions. And by the way, I'm going to speak about these preconditions, bringing to attention that the infrastructure in the country is completely poor. I would say 80% of the infrastructure is very poor to have a speedy mobility for the elections. For instance, 7 states were affected with floods, and now floods are still renewing. And we have heard from IGAD Climate Change Office that the western side of South Sudan is going to face a drought. The eastern side is going to face huge floods than before. So infrastructure is very poor. So infrastructure by itself, it's a challenge for the performance of the government to deliver that. Besides that, you need resources. Resources for what? You need resources for printing civic education materials. And these civic education materials with a high rate of illiteracy, you may need to translate them into national languages. It means money is needed here. A very big dollar value is needed to deliver this. Besides this, you have the essential legal frameworks that, like what I've mentioned before, all those necessary institutional reforms, legislation reforms need to be delivered in a shortest period of time. And we have seen the practice that our government have is that always they make a public statement, but their commitment to complying with what they say, it's completely contrary. Like, I will give an example. Less than a month, they signed an agreement on the implementation of the security arrangement. And in that agreement, I've mentioned that the day they signed the agreement, in 1 week period from day of signed agreement, they would graduate the first batch of the unified forces. We're now going to the 3rd week without graduation of the unified forces. So examples of empty promises for political actions in the country were being seen and were being observed. And a lot of excuses were being made around it. Either we don't have a uniform or we don't have arms to graduate the forces, while these are actual fighting forces. So now if you look at the timeline that we have now, we are soon hitting to rain season from May until September or October. So when rainy season started, the country will be disconnected. Government capacity to really have a mobility and to have energy of reaching out to communities during the rain season is completely very low. 3/4 of the communities are having violence among themselves. Intercommunal violence is scaling up in the country. We're losing lives. As we're speaking with you now, tension is brewing between the communities of Jongole and the Pibor as we're speaking now. In Magui, there's a tension between pastoralists and farmers. Still that is unresolved, and the same is extended to Kajukeji, to Lanya, to some parts of Yei. And Tombora, less than a year, we have seen a deadly violence happening on the situation among different ethnic groups. And we can see road ambushes that are going on. And refugees across the country or across the continent, we have quite a number of South Sudan refugees in Uganda, in Sudan. To what level are they living in that particular situation that we're able to reach with them with voter education and set up a system for them to vote? And don't forget internal displaced people who are within the country in different camps, where we term them as Banden, as protection of civilian sites, as POC, which is now called as internal displaced person camps in Juba, in Melekal, in Bentiu, in Bor. Still, you need to really handle those issues. So, because it's not easy for someone to go right now for campaign without having a complete democratic civic space to move. And when I say civic space, sometimes even some communities sanction civic space apart from state sanctioning civic space. Some communities will not allow anybody to campaign. For example, if I want to campaign for presidency, some communities may not allow someone like me to express myself. Typically, communities that are having conflict among themselves and revenge attacks, a politician cannot cross from one community to another to campaign because of the absence of institutions that will provide rule of law outside the urban setup towns of South Sudan, and where majority of our voters are in the rural setup of South Sudan, where in the rural setups, the situation and the political situation is not healthy for electoral campaign of electoral processes.
You had mentioned that there's been tension now brewing between the communities, particularly the Boer community, the Murle community, and the Lone Noir. Can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, we are getting an alarm that there's a preparation going on from the neighbors of the Murle, and that is mainly the Lone Noir and Dinkabur, that the youth are mobilizing themselves. This is not for the first time. I've seen these events before, and we've seen before the 2013 crisis. His Excellency, First Vice President Dr. Riek Machar was one time in 2010 went to Akobo and to stop the White Army from attacking Murle from Akobo side, and similar mobilization is going on. And actually, even this year, early last year, similar mobilization has happened. So right now we're getting information that there's a massive mobilization, joint movement of Lone Noir and Dinkabur. They want to wage attack to 3 towns in Greater Pibor administrative area that is targeting places like Boma, Gumruk, and Pibor by itself, and areas like Likongole may be vulnerable. So because this is, they say they have seen the state not responding hard in disciplining the community of Murle who come from Pibor area, because Murle have been attacking the Dinkabur, they have been raiding, and there's quite a number of incidents that they have committed, as you can consider, as human rights atrocities against their neighbors who are Lone Noir and Dinkabur, but also similar atrocities were committed by the Dinkabur against the Murle, or by the Lone Noir against the Murle. We've seen an incident where Murle traders were killed in Bor town, and that led to an revenge attack where Murle attacked Baidit, Payam, and all of these constitute crimes that are serious in terms of human rights violations. So this is a practical situation that is happening, and similar situation may arise if we don't control the tension between pastoralists and farmers in Magui. So all these pockets, that sounds to be armed communal violence, which for me, really, they're politically motivated violence. And they are supported by few elites in the urban setups. If we don't sort out this particular situation, then how can we conduct election?
Mm-hmm. On the issue of oil production and revenue, it has been stated in the report that South Sudan has made limited progress implementing public financial management, PFM reforms, notably resulting in stabilization of the exchange rate and improvements in non-oil revenue collections. However, lack of transparent accounting for oil revenues and loans collateralized with oil cargo facilitates significant revenue leakage and diversion by corrupt actors, undermining the already negligible financing of basic services for South Sudanese people. What are your thoughts on the limited reforms in the public financial management and the diversion of oil revenue to corrupt officials?
This is really a plus for our leaders in regard to the acknowledged and the recognized reforms that they are able to deliver in the financial management. And of course, I'm closely watching how these reforms are attained in terms of institutional setup. There's a very strategic institutional setup to really work together with the government finance institution to deliver these reforms, which have been acknowledged, which for me, it's really a plus. It's a gain for the government to invest and utilize it to win the acceptance and to change the attitudes of international community, in particular like US, to make sure that they can open a window of a dialogue. If they could have utilized the gains that have been acknowledged by US government, acknowledged by IMF, acknowledged by World Bank, if they're to use it properly. But of course, always the devil is in the details. And here when we talk about the details is around the transparency. We have seen an improvement in the oil price. And we have seen a good improvement in collecting non-oil revenues in the country. And of course, it's always declared that some government officials, sometimes they don't declare it regularly, but sometimes they declare of how much they're able to generate from the non-oil revenue and how much they're able to generate from the oil revenue. Now, the challenges are in the usage of this money and the deliverable out of the usage of the money. The usage of the money is not transparent, is really unknown, whether it be loans coming from IMF or coming from World Bank or other financial institutions like African Development Bank, or through the oil revenue or the non-oil revenue. The way how these resources are used, there's lack of transparency there. There's no proper reports coming. And one of the indicators that could have shown transparency, if the government could have allowed its own instrument, like the National General Auditor can audit the book of the government periodically, a bit annually, and before any new financial year budget, we could have seen a national auditor report on the usage of the past revenue that are collected, revenue or the non-oil revenue or through loans that are coming from other financial facilities. That could have helped the element of transparency and availing information, even publishing information. If the government could have published information, that could have happened. Besides that, we have seen some individuals that are really having access to lump sum figure of money that it's abnormal. Everybody start questioning, like, why is this happening? You remember when recently in New York, when Her Excellency Vice President Mama Rebecca Nyandeng went to attend the UN Security Council session and attend on behalf of the president, and she is meeting with financial institutions like World Bank, then immediately if information was leaked out of South Sudan that offers around $65 million are to be given to an individual, and the processing, the procurement of that particular figure, which is around 64 million, is a problematic, and it raised an eyebrow before Mama Rebecca, and Mama Rebecca have to communicate back to the country that, look here, this particular practice is hindering our reputation, our gains around the financial management before the global financial facility like World Bank, because World Bank questioned them. And I think President have to cancel that deal. It's a big deal. So such deals is really undermining the proper usage of public funds for delivering social services to the citizens, but also implementing the revitalized peace agreement. You can hear people say we don't have money to implement the agreement, but you can see purchase of new security institutions, facility or instruments are having, like when we had recently say, we don't have money to graduate our forces because of the arms embargo, but we see police possessing good number of vehicles that are armed, mounted vehicles. Of course, we need our police to be well equipped because we need rule of law to prevail. We need our safety and protection from our police, but that should be in line with the revitalized peace agreement in terms of facilitating the unification of forces, unify the an action of unifying the police. So the usage of the money is so much disputed that some individuals, besides all these reforms that are seen in terms of practice, in terms of institution, and as a result that you have mentioned, is I was able to stabilize the exchange gain rate, and people are able to see, citizens are able to feel that, oh, there's improvement in finance. But when you equate that to the delivery of social services to the citizens, you come completely, is a big difference. And you start asking, what happened with the money? Where is the money gone? Who is using the money? Who is enjoying the money? So you come to realize a minority few elites have access to that money, and they really misuse this money for their personal gain. And of course, this coming from where? This coming from question of leadership. You need to have a leadership that is aggressive, a leadership that commit itself for the principle of transparency and accountability, and push their subordinates to respect all the reforms that were enshrined in line of public finance management.
Mm-hmm. The conflict in Tombora has displaced a large population, and it was addressed in the report by the US government and its policy towards South Sudan. In the report, it mentioned, competition for political power and economic resources manifests in fighting between proxies with political sub-factions manipulating ethnic and communal tensions to their advantage, often leading to violence, displacement, and serious human rights abuses. Clashes in Tombora, Western Equatoria State in 2021 were especially violent, displacing over 70,000 people. The UN mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, documented 179 incidents between June 1st and August 31st, 2021 that negatively affected human rights and protection of civilians, including reported killings, injuries, and abductions. Among those implicated in fueling the violence were local, state, and federal officials and armed groups over which they have influence. Tombora is illustrative of subnational violence and insecurity occurring throughout the country, which are marked by reports of sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary arrest and detention, torture and ill treatment, forced military conscription, and the looting and destruction of civilian property. What led to the conflict in Tombora, and what is the current state of the Tombora County at this time?
Thank you very much. Personally, I was engaged in these Tombora situations as a mediator. I've been on the ground multiple times or several times. I've been on the ground engaging, working with the conflicting communities. So what made Tombora crisis to happen? It's really a competition among the political elites by using ethnic lines as a card to sustain influence in controlling political power and resources. And even some of them want to change history for political gain so they can use that particular influence to sustain the political influence over their communities, to act as representative or political leaders of their communities. That's what triggered. And because of this unhealthy competition among the political elites for control of power and access to resources, they turn to mobilize the youth in the community and arm them, and making sure that they are well armed, and that give them the authority to force these youth to kill or to shoot at each other, and that have resulted to what you describe as a human rights abuses and breakdown in the rule of law and absence of really public order. This simply is a creation of these political elites, where it's described by the report as subnational. And of course, for me, I add the word politically motivated violence. So that is a clear indicator. And remember, this is a last year incident. After Tombora, were there any similar incidents? There are more than 3 or 4 similar incidents like Tombora. You have recently the case of Lair, you have what is going on in Magui, you have some parts of Upper Nile like Maiwut, around the area of Koch, and then the area of Pagak. You have incidents that are going similarly to Tombora, and they are also as worse as Tombora situation. So you can see that the leadership or political will to stop the subnational political motivated violence is very low, because we could have assessed since the occurrence of Tombora, were there any incidents? Yes, there were incidents. If there were no incidents, they can say there's a political will to resolve that. And this is also tells you why sometimes the concept of the arms embargo become very important. So it means now we are decentralizing violence by the change in the political attitudes that are more violent, because political elites start using violence as a ladder to power. And these have decentralized conflict from really fighting on political theory of public governance. We're now fighting on ethnic dominance of governance. And this takes us to a level that is very hard to mitigate with the case study of Tombora that you have seen. How is Tombora now? Tombora is calm. The situation is calm because of the demilitarization, but still there are incidents among the conflicting communities, attacks on roads, assassinations, target killings are still going on. So still the level of fear among the communities that at any moment, at any time, they may return to violence is still high.
Since South Sudan gained independence in 2011, and even after the conflict that erupted in 2013, the US government has spent billions of dollars in the country, primarily focused on humanitarian assistance. It is important to note that total US government humanitarian assistance to South Sudan in fiscal year 2020 was nearly $692 million, including programming from USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. In fiscal year 2020, the State Department provided $20.5 million in assistance to the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission to support its oversight of implementation of the RRCAS, and to the Ceasefire and Transitional Security Arrangement Monitoring and Evaluation Mechanism to support monitoring adherence to the terms of the ceasefire. Obviously, the US government cannot continue to provide humanitarian assistance to South Sudan without expecting anything in return. What do you think is the long-term goal of the US in terms of its diplomatic relations and its policy framework towards South Sudan?
I think one of the long-term objective of US or interest, as is mentioned in the report, is that you can't spend such big dollar value without any gains that meet global interest. Of course, the global interest is the real interest of having the global responsibility to protect being exercised in South Sudan by the government through what we call as foreign aid in whatever format it is, being it humanitarian, being it borrowing, or being it contributions. At the end of the day, all this money are taxpayers' money that you wish to see peace and stability, protection of individuals, civilians, South Sudan prevail. That's why you invest. So that's a gain that we just want to see, that at least the level of government commitment to avail protection of individuals and communities is per their expectation to a standard that they wish. So based on this, if the government failed to deliver this, the chances that US will have a different policy approach towards South Sudan is going to be so faster. And I think this particular policy is sending a message. And that's why I'm saying it's a wake-up call that US is getting frustrated from time to time. And they feel now we need to really push so fast to level that South Sudan leaders have a political attitude change to deliver their required the constitutional obligation, which is actually their primary responsibility to ensure the best interest of citizens are met, whether through transformation of the country in a political way that is more democratic, more successful, more non-violent, and service delivery is given to citizens. But also, I think US is intent to send a message here that I would like to bring, because always there's this public statement from politicians that the first agreement that was signed between the SPLA as a rebel fighting force in South Sudan with Sudan government, what is called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, many politicians were saying it was successfully implemented because there was an international support. And mainly we hear Drake have been quoted that Drake have put a good money for that agreement to be implemented. That was successful. And there's arguments that this particular agreement have no international support. I think US also intending to send a message to the citizens and to the public, to the global community, that they have invested for the implementation of the revitalized agreement, but they invested from the side of where they want to make sure that the mechanism that were designed into agreement to ensure the agreement is properly delivered, these mechanisms are functional. And in particular, RGMEC and CITISM. That's why US was trying to send a message that no, we have never lifted our hands in supporting peace, but this time we tend to support peace by ensuring mechanisms that are entrusted to ensure the agreement is delivered are functional. That's why I think they mentioned clearly their support to RGMEC and CITISM. And this contradicts some of our leaders that actually US have not put any money to support the revitalized agreement, and thus the agreement implementation become harder because lack of finance. But I think US will send a signal that we want to check on you also, your own national resources. How much of it are you investing for securing peace and stability for your own country as a leader? So I think that's the tech that's coming forward. I think our government still have a chance, and the ball is in their hands. And what they can do is use the few gains they have that were acknowledged by US, were acknowledged by trade, and invest on that by delivering some of the list, because it's a clear in this policy statement of US that there's a list of expectation that you can easily take them one by one, and does not cost our leaders really 1 month to deliver some of those wishes or some of those expectations in the wish list of US through their policy. So I think still our leaders have opportunity if they have the will to change their attitudes, if they have the will to deliver, if they have the will to use our revenue properly to meet some of those expectations raised in US recent policy statement.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Edmund Yakani. We've been joined in the program by him. He is the Executive Director of CEPO. Thank you for coming on Beyond the Headlines.
Yeah, thank you for hosting me too.
Thank you.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube page at Sunrise Media.